They would take turns. On Wednesday, Shara would be with Mani remotely while he sat at the bar watching her. And on Sunday, Mani would be with Janie as he watched her alone lie at the bar. He was pondering this at one time, and suddenly these words formed in his mind, and she was missing everything while he was with everything, and Shara was missing everything, while they were having everything, and he was loving everything but he was missing everything. It was part of a song. It was poignant as it explained what was going on between him, Shara, and Janie, but it was also much, much more than that. It was a song about life. It was a song about incarnation. Mani first heard this song in these days when he was smoking out front at the bar. He was listening, quietly. It was the same day that he realized that Shara was hearing the screams far, far louder than he ever imagined, when he thought the screams were all gone. It was the day he opened up his bathroom door and the sound of the fan in the ceiling revealed the ugly truth. Shara was hearing more than anyone could possibly withstand. He tried his best to comfort her, and the only thing he could think to do was to go to the bar. That afternoon Shara was bartending. Mani plopped his book on the bar and read out loud in his mind. He believed that Shara could hear him reading every word, very loud, as if they were coming from the speakers that the jukebox played from. He sat quietly, listening to himself speak in his mind. The Shara who was bartending then was the Shara that was unconscious. The Shara that Mani knew, the invisible Shara who heard the screams in the shadows, was the Shara of the physical bartender's subconscious. The invisible Shara that could see and hear. Perhaps it was a Shara from the future or a higher dimension. The invisible Shara had been in direct communication, telepathically, with Mani since the day she detected the sacred grove in his presence. After reading for a while, Mani went out front and smoked, and then he thought he heard something. Again. There he was again. It was so quiet, but he heard what sounded like a melody, and words. It was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time, but above all, there were no words that could adequately describe it. While he listened, he saw the song spin upwards like a record, rotating in the sky, evolving as it lifted higher and higher. No, he could never remember all the lines, because they were wordless. There was no melody, but when you listened to it, you felt like you would feel if you were hearing some timeless song from a world familiar yet forgotten. For Mani, this is the best approximation of how it went, but every time he tried to remember it, it was different. I'm being everything and I'm loving everything and I just missed everything because I forgot everything, but you remembered everything. You remembered everyone. While I forget everything, and I forgot everyone, and I messed up everything, but now I found everything, and now I found everyone, because you found me every time, and you found me everyone, just like you said you would, just like I said I would, but we just missed everything. We just missed everyone. Because everyone's everyone. And everyone's everything. So we forgot everyone because you just left everything. We do this every time. So we just lost everything. We just lost everyone. We just lost every time. But pray we find everything. Pray this time every way, pray we can stay this way. Pray it can be this way. So we don't forget everyone, so we don't lose anyone, because if we lose anyone, we just lost everyone, and we'd forget everything. And it went on and on like this, and every time a new line was spoken, the implications of the song got more, and more, and more chillingly profound to Mani. After listening for a few minutes, spellbound, he suddenly became crazily thirsty for a drink, so went inside as quickly as he could and got a drink from the physical Shara. As soon as he gulped half of it down, he came right back out and asked the invisible Shara if he missed anything. She then said, as if she was upset and bewildered and speechless, "You just missed everything." And in that moment he felt he just missed the secret of the song, and was likewise speechless, aching with an unknowable loss. In those same days, when Mani was sitting alone in the living room of his apartment in silence, he heard one other song that had no melody, and no words. And yet it had both, and they could be felt. The only lines that he could make out went something like this: somehow, somewhere I will find you. At the same time, crisscrossing those lines were these lines, in a voice of the opposite gender: I will find you somewhere, somehow. When Maney heard this other song with no words or melody, he again got chills. Then he felt something in his heart that reminded him of an anvil being hammered upon in a forge. His eyes then filled with invisible tears. The air show. Once upon a time, this time, Maney's friend Angus took him to an air show, where they watched jets twist and turn in the sky, and Maney and his scout Shara moved about the perimeter and stalked each other. Finally, with called upon permissions, Shara came upon Maney and Maney said, "You may. Please." And slowly, she stepped into his body. She sinked into it like a pool, like a hot tub. Maney could feel her taking part of him, becoming one with him. From his forearms to his shoulders she slipped down again into him and sighed, and together they were one. Maney and Shara, the first two in heaven. He didn't want to make assumptions, Maney, so he ordered 3 hot potato cakes, wondering if Shara was a vegan, for she had just stepped inside of him. They were returning together from the air show. Princess of the Air, whispering Princess of Wind, so cute, adorable. She was with a tattoo on the back of her neck, and 7 million screams betrayed them when he found her screaming in the bathroom, dark and black. Just when he thought he'd cleaned it all up again, his words, the screaming men he thought he'd reconciled, over and over, again and again. Shara, I love you. I'm so sorry, babe. Within a few weeks, Maney never saw or felt Shara again. Maney stood solidly in his apartment living room and said, "My name is Maney, and I never went to hell, and I never will, because I'm God, and I said so. I'm going to heaven and I'm taking everyone with me." The dog was in the bar, using his mind. He looked at the screens, and also had cigarettes on the back patio. He started to giggle with a husky dog laugh, but he tries not to show it. This makes him giggle more. He tries so hard not to laugh. This brings him into hysterics. He thinks the red handkerchief he is wearing around his neck is so funny. He tries to pretend like he doesn't look ridiculous, because it's funnier that way. But he doesn't want to think with the word ridiculous, because it implies that there may be something wrong or overly silly about it. He doesn't want to acknowledge that he is trying not to think about the concept of ridiculous with the thought forms of the originally apprehended potential concept he was thinking of. In this way, the dog hid his own thoughts from himself, or at least pretends to be doing so. He pauses and considers the awesomeness of it all. Then he looks again at himself in the mirror and sees the awesomeness of the red handkerchief around his neck, and he pauses and waits and looks away. It is of utmost importance, the dog thought without words, that all of this I am accomplishing is implied without implying. Then, just then it starts to get to him. He tries not to laugh about it, the red bandana, being all suited up, sleek, at the pub, watching golf, meticulously, but he can't help it. He starts to giggle again, and the giggles then turn into hysterics. And he starts laughing so hard that he has to leave because he doesn't want to make a scene. He doesn't pay off his tab, because he knows that they know that he'll be back, and he stumbles around in the parking lot, laughing so hard it was almost impossible for him to find his way home. Alternate tab. Walking around the plaza, he had gotten into the habit of leaving his apartment door open, giving a signal to power that he was vulnerable, available. He walked in sandals, sometimes in bare feet. And he went to a particular place where they sold beer and wings, and he bought beer and wondered if they would ask him to pay. For, in his mind and with what he felt coming, hearing, and heralding from the future, money was no longer a parlance that was being utilized. He thought that everyone around him was testing him. So, one time he didn't even bring his wallet, and when they asked him to pay off, he looked directly at the person asking and said, "Really?" and waited 2 seconds. And when he saw that they were serious, he said, "Okay, let me go get it, it is at home. It will take 20 minutes, I'll be back." And he went home, got his wallet and returned and paid off his tab. Another time Maney was out there, at that particular place, hearing booms of what he believed to be the fireworks of the expansion of awareness taking place. He wished for the perfect idiot to show up. He felt he needed one because everyone he spoke to was speaking to him with language as if they had an ascended mind from the future, and he could not relate. And after all, he was administering the Who's God Now? As he called it, awakening them in their unskilled stupor as they were still working through the first two heavens. But there will be time to explain all that. In the first heaven you are a fool, and you make yourself beautiful and rich, but you have not learned to love one another, and so fighting and separation still exists. The second heaven is when you wish to learn to get to know one another from the beginning to the end and become friends, and you develop superpowers only through the passage of time, and your experience grows richer and richer. The third heaven is the best one of all, because only then do you know that the first two hells never existed, only the third one did, and that one was based on illusion. The perfect idiot arrived. Maney was so happy to see him. He was in the form of someone, coming from the present, mocking him. Maney played along. The man stood over Maney's circular table on the patio at the Beer and Wings place and talked like an idiot, on purpose, thinking that Maney was a mad retard. Maney loved this, and he went back and forth with the perfect idiot as they held up some semblance of a conversation, Maney countering everything the perfect idiot said. And the perfect idiot said something about drinking a 12-pack of beer. And Maney said, "A case. That's what I do." And he smiled authentically. And the perfect idiot left within 2 minutes after this. And meanwhile Maney could smell the fireworks going off, the expansion of awareness as it hit itself, one on another, cascading and waking up groups and pockets of awareness. At this time, Maney was beginning to understand that he was listening to the present and not one, but two futures, through his ears. He could hear thoughts and ideas, or thought he could, not from just the present, but from the future and the future's future, at least 2 timelines ahead while operating in the present. Sitting there on that patio, at the Wings and Beer place, and soon in his apartment, he played a particular song in his mind, and delivered it as a message to all who could hear his loud thoughts. The song was about how he was a rebel and a catalyst for unanticipated and unmitigated change. In this way, the Who's God Now? Proceeded through time and space. Maney would wake the world up. And the world would cascade and echo this procession, and the world would then smack Maney cleverly, trumping back with lessons learned, like with hospitals and places of recovery, and resistances heralding back in spades, and sometimes in faster ways, yet still, Maney Who's God? Ed them right back, and he walked around the area in and around his apartment, while his teacher Master Tso recorded it all. And everything he said became an aphorism. As he tumbled and walked on he would say things sublime. But at around the same time, Maney had crazed himself in order to accept something unusual and unexpected being asked of him, and would say things like, "Who's to say, man? I don't know, man. What the fuck, man? So you say, man." And he said these things with jerking dancing motions, like it was a song by an old school hip-hop artist. 4. While sitting at a round table in his dining room, alone, he heard his teacher, Master Tso, contact him in his mind. "Do you accept this responsibility?" asked Master Tso. "Who's to say, what the fuck, man? Why not, let's get it on, man." And he proved his madness and his relinquishment of self-image. And Master Tso knew then that the lot was already cast. And so Tso and another one that he worked with enlisted Maney in a terrible task. And Maney set his intent to complete it. That was how it went, and would go. After he lost his job, to 5 cities he went. He thought he might be in the astral plane, or plane of illusion, but as things progressed, he found out that it was others that thought he was in the plane of astral, of fears. They thought that they would support him, delicate as they could, because after all, he'd only crossed the 2 single quote ND initiation and gone crazy, We've all been through it, but in this case we actually set up the proxy pseudo-world in order for Manny to gather his feelings, recapitulate, and move forward. But while all this was being derived, and while Manny was driving around the state, a new story sprung up. Secret, safe, and most of all dangerous. For whenever Manny drove his car, at first he'd hear compliments, like "you're so beautiful." Then after 10 seconds he'd hear "oh my god." And he knew that they would have to go through initiations that they hated all over again, only this time with more understanding. A higher stage of evolution, they began to understand the implications of something that they initiated a long time ago, on their own warrior's path. Manny was administering the Who's God Now? The Who's God Now, as Manny liked to call it, is when the created reflects on the creator, and the student becomes the teacher. However, the Who's God Now goes both ways, and Manny would alternate giving it and receiving it too. The Lord of the World and the Yellow Bat when Manny was in the thick of his altered states of perception as he was on his way, walking to the plaza where the bar was. A man started yelling and running towards him. He had a yellow plastic bat, and he held it behind his left shoulder as if he was going to strike Manny like a baseball, and Manny simply looked into his eyes, with no reaction delicately, and after a few seconds the Lord of the World simply walked away, for he had now just seen Manny passing successfully the 3D initiation. The transfiguration only this time simply implied, and Manny ate these things for breakfast, and he recollected H.P. Blavatsky describing what it was like for her to look into the eyes of the Lord of the World and how she could barely bear it and had to turn away. And the mortal youth, an innocent endless summer, a snowy mountain top near Shambhala, an eternal spring, where water of life springs and where most walk through it, knee-deep, if they do at all, upon the path to heaven where Jesus dances and sings "Don't You Forget About Me." And it began to rain the kiddie pool. It was around this time when Manny began to believe, to understand, that he was placed in a kiddie pool, as he called it, by Master Tso and his closest associates, so he could learn how to use his thoughts with skill. He was being taught to think without using words, so as not to disrupt a greater mind link that was being used by the Great White Lodge of Ascended Masters. As of yet, Manny lacked the skill to use his mind properly enough that he would not be more of a problem than a help. His voice was too loud, and he needed to be given a special, closed-off space in the mental plane to practice with some other apprentices in order to learn how to talk and convey ideas in the mental plane or existence, without shouting his thoughts at a level that would disrupt the work that was going on there. Like a toddler running around in the world of thoughts, Manny was still generally unaware how loud his thoughts were and what steps were being put in place to make sure that those thoughts were contained, and so he telepathically communicated in the kiddie pool mind link with about 3 or 4 other individuals who were also working to train their thoughts. But all were mostly there to help Manny learn how not to think out loud so much. For indeed, his voice was unusually loud, and it was a concern by them in the mental plane to hear such a voice, untrained, entering their field. These were strange days for Manny as he drove around in his car, hearing his compatriots talking to him in his mind while he looked upon the people in the cars and yards around him. In a fake heaven, set up for him, as him coming back from hell, who needed to be slowly reacquainted with life, people, doing fake things. Avatars on autopilot. All this set up to help Manny. But Manny saw through it. He saw through that so well that this situation became a problem. Manny moved around and had his being, and the avatars that were swirling about in this demiplane began to become alive. The illusions that were meant to occupy his mind to allow him to learn were taking on a life of their own. The illusory place that he was in was becoming real, and not just for him. Manny was already awake, and the realization of it was terrifying for those who had programmed it all in order to help him. The Who's God Now was being administered, and it was terrifying to those who set up this situation with an unexpected result. And the world that everyone began to perceive and hear as a primary perception became more real. But, oh no. not this world. They thought, each beginning to apprehend the implications of what was beginning to happen. This world was only supposed to be a simulation to help Maney, but now the system administrators were becoming a part of it. Terror. Back down to the hulls forgotten. Will it never end? Thought all those who thought they were only helping someone on a lower astral plane become more real. Behold, they had to face their own fakeness and go through challenges that they thought they had already overcome to become more real again. While Maney went through his own challenges, and it was difficult to know whether they were challenges new or ancient ones, long forgot. Maney sees God smoking, and the third perfect idiot said to him, "Why did you tell Piranesi that you are God?" And he said to him, "Because everyone is God, it is only a question of their degree of awareness." But Maney had no firm recollection of telling Piranesi this. These were the days when he was completely beyond ordinary, Maney saying strange things as he went about his business. This was an especially odd afternoon, for Maney was now talking to himself in front of everyone directly, as if they were there in third person and he was in one's person, the author of the patio they were spending time in. And then he got up and began smoking, and he saw old men looming around coming out to smoke too. TVs were on, and Maney had a silent revelation that the name of one of the old men was God. How Maney got banned from heaven, and how it was feared he would go to hell 3 times and then delete himself. And in these days Maney wore himself out, and he had tired, German Shepherd eyes on. One weekend when Ray Greer was bartending, Maney was contemplating things in his bedroom. He thought about the world around him, and whether it was a phantasmal realm that was trying to elicit his realness, while all along it was vice versa, and he was so ready to go back to the bar, his peace. Thinking in this manner, he began to dress himself in his apartment, but found that he couldn't find his belt. After searching for 10 minutes, he decided he'd just walk to the store and buy a new one. Never mind that it was 45 minutes away. He walked, in bare feet and with shorts, holding his shorts up with his left hand. They would fall off otherwise, for he was skinny then. He went to the store, feeling everyone driving by him saying, "You're beautiful." And he would just shrug or shake his head in his mind, because he knew that they thought he was still roaming the astral plane, where they thought he was trying to remember himself. But in truth, he was creating a new world, and by them interacting with him, they entered his world then whether they liked it or not. And he saw the gravity of it all, and accepted this strange quirk of everyone's fate. He bought a belt in the store and returned home. Then, after this journey, he walked to the bar so tired. And he sat there, waiting to be served. But the owner of the bar, Ray Greer, never came to him. He thought that she wasn't serving him because she thought he was in his own personal hell, and so wasn't allowed to drink. He thought that everyone else was just placating him while he licked his wounds from a lower plane. Everyone would play along for Maney as he recovered from the plane of existence too terrible to speak of or imagine. But Maney was not at that state of awareness. He was there, more present than the illusions that were placed around him. He wanted everyone to know that he was ready to go to heaven, for everyone to get to know each other, slowly. And that the foolishness of wanton power over each other had been squarely dealt with, and overthrown. He was one of those aware, and he was only waiting for everyone else to acknowledge it. Finally, at the bar, he got her attention, and looked her squarely in the eyes and said, "Look, I know I'm in heaven. May I please have a drink?" Mind you, Maney had a few different versions of heaven, but at that moment, he was in most of them. Finally, and Ray Greer did some deliberation in her head and then said, "I can't serve you." And he was confounded, and hurt, and bled, and he backed out of the bar, quietly. However, his friend Ruchi was there. All the while, though Maney barely registered it, he was so tired. And he thought that the people he saw in his life then may not have a real understanding of his state of awareness, may have a fool's understanding of where he was at, what he was working with. But Ruchi caught up with Mani as he walked away, and Mani said to him, "Can we walk? Just go for a walk together?" And Ruchi agreed, and so they walked around the neighborhood, the suburb, near where Mani lived, which was in walking distance to the bar. And so began an ancient but nascent initiation sequence that took Mani far beyond his current status. The entire sequence was never meant to be completed in one single lifetime, but for some reason with Mani, a chain reaction would begin that would terrify the galaxy. The real fear began when Emmanuel was walking with Ruchi. It happened in this way, today, and tonight. We will see how tough we are. Something is in place. A wordless challenge that no one has ever participated in. You and I will do this. I love you. These words came from Master Tso around the time of breakfast, and Mani was barely awake. They did agree though, upon one thing: the European breakfast with braised tomatoes and sautéed mushrooms was superior. We shall perform the 18 initiations, and beyond that? I don't know. The voice of Master Tso was only a blur in Mani's mind. Did I just hear that? Mani thought. Yes, he heard. It was a sad day, but this is how it went down. Every step Mani took, he felt a future world thinking that he was going down the path of annihilation. Every single word that he said, every movement or shift in his pelvis he made was interpreted by a future version of the world as some indication that he was revealing that he was going to end himself in order to save the all. And he looked at Ruchi with scared eyes, because he then understood that Ruchi saw and believed this to be true, that Mani was about to end himself, thinking he was going to delete himself so he didn't have to go to hell over and over again in order to save everyone. And Mani was so sad to see this. He saw that every motion, everything he did, fulfilled an ancient unwritten emptiness which Ruchi administered to. Ruchi. I'm so sorry, Mani said as they moved through the neighborhood, in a path that circled back. And twice, Mani stopped, and asked Ruchi if he could give him a hug. And they hugged, twice, Mani on the verge of tears. See, Mani believed that Ruchi, with an entire host of ascended beings from the future, believed that Mani thought that he believed that he needed to eradicate himself in order to save the lives of others, because Mani understood how powerful he was but out of control he was, a creation of God that was beyond what the rest of creation could sustain. And Ruchi was thinking this, that Mani thought he needed to kill himself in order to keep the rest of creation intact. But Mani knew all this all along and had proven to himself that he wouldn't kill himself and therefore he would not kill everyone else, still as a weakest link. But he also knew, in this world that he thought was becoming heaven, that other people, including Ruchi, didn't know that he had made this realization. So as they moved around this neighborhood, Mani hurt, and hurt again, as he talked to Ruchi and thought that Ruchi thought that Mani was going to stupidly go into his own annihilation as a sacrifice due to an illusion. After their parting, Mani continued to walk around, listening to his teacher and friend Master Tso telepathically. He went to a gas station and bought some water. But before drinking that bottle, in the store, he only took a sip, and then dropped it. For he felt it was symbolic of him dousing the pits of hell, and if he were to do so, it would represent pity, and if he had pity, he would only allow the pits of hell to exist. And when he dropped the water, when it hit the floor in the gas station, it sounded like a gunshot, so the person behind the counter called the cops. Mani kept walking around the neighborhoods unaware of this time to a new place, and he sat down, thinking if only he could keep his body from moving and shaking, the worlds could keep existing without having to worry about the fact that Mani existed. And then the cops showed up, got out of their cars, and were about to arrest him. But Ruchi had been driving around, watching Mani. And he was a smooth talker, and after 10 minutes, he convinced the cops to let Mani go, though they had already prepared his hands for the cuffs. And so, Ruchi, taking responsibility for Mani, let Mani into his car and they drove around. Mani knew that this night, it would be best if he didn't have to face the world. So he said and asked to Ruchi, would you be alright if we just drove around tonight? Just drive around all night? Head north, break the rules? Just drive and talk together? And Ruchi played along but didn't go along with the plan. They, instead, went to a lake that Maney would walk around periodically, and the initiations continued. Maney was listening to two Master Tsos, one of the future, and one of the more distant future. Master Tso, all along who had a plan. He knew, prior to birth, that Maney would be his apprentice that was ready to do the impossible, to complete all of the initiations in one lifetime. He knew it was a risk, but Master Tso, Master Dancer, was tired of all the suffering, so he cast his lot with Maney. And so while Maney walked around the lake, he listened to and heard both the future and the future's future Master Tso, who each had different titles, and they both spoke in riddles. And they did this so that Maney would take the right steps. Everything that Maney did, including taking off his sandals and continuing to walk the sandals, Ruchi picked them up, was interpreted as him giving indications that he was doing his dance of death, his last piece with the world before he absoluted himself in an immortal suicide. But the future's future Master Tso knew that it would be perceived this way, and as a result, the actions taken by those witnessing Maney would result in another, and so he took the punches standing up like a real man. The future's future Master Tso, in order to save, collaborating with Emmanuel, tried to save everything. And together they clasped their hands in tears, knowing that this was going to be the hardest thing they'd ever have to do. And Maney's heart wept for Master Tso, as he knew that he had to put Maney through this torment, this hell, and he knew that Master Tso went through an even deeper hell, having to witness Maney thinking he had to do this. Tso saw all of the sorry eyes of people thinking that people were going to hell, and his sorry instrument and proxy was Maney. He had sworn an oath never to abuse another's free will, never to hurt. And he didn't break that oath, but what was happening hurt. It went on like this. Finally, it ended. Maney refused to go into his apartment, because he felt as if that action it might symbolically be interpreted as entering the tomb that Jesus entered after the crucifixion. So instead, he walked around, taking further and more obscure and esoteric initiations, talking to himself, wondering where Shara was. Finally, he came down on his knees in a parking lot outside of a used tire store. Ruchi and his friends made themselves known and arrived in form, after the police were called again, and negotiated for Maney to go to the hospital. Maney, no longer understanding what was going on at the ground level up in the heavens and hells as his mind was, observed the ambulance arriving. Ruchi, his friend Odu, and a woman with him he didn't know, were all standing, looking at the scene from about 25 feet away. The men in the ambulance were there to take him in. And Maney said, "Only if my friends say it is the right thing to do. Only if they agree." And they said they already talked to his friends. And he said, "Only if Odu agrees." And then they took him, strapped him down into a cart, and put him in the ambulance. And Maney no longer had free will. And then he accepted his fate. After completing all of the initiations, or rather coming to their ultimation, he sat in the hospital room. He quaked and moved back and forth from heavens to hells, and every time he swayed future worlds would have to plummet with him, or without him, and they hated him for it. And after a certain point, he felt compelled by humility to walk out into the lobby area and fall down and lay crucified on the floor like a nun's initiation, getting closer to God, who was humble. And then he stood up and said, "I am the world teacher." And he hated saying it but was compelled to do so in order to demonstrate humility, and in this way resume his karma. And he waited, and waited 45 minutes until his brother showed up with the red ball cap to save him. "Everything I say is magic," Maney would eventually explain to the psychologist in the first rehab, after being asked what words he might have been hearing in that room together while they talked, and his brother observed. When Maney went to the hospital in the habs, he was dead sober. Not a drip of alcohol was in him except when in the hospital he was misdiagnosed and given a slow drip of alcohol. This served to wipe this experience from his memory entirely except for a few moments. Maney remembered a couple of things. 1. Leaving the bathroom door open when he went to the bathroom just to make sure that she knew everything would be okay. 2. Spinning around walking with the girl that actually allowed him to get a chicken salad sandwich. When he spun around he saw another girl about 15 feet behind him walking the same way and she smiled. And he liked that she smiled. How they let him go in the hospital. Before the first rehab at the end, there were not one but two psychologists who reviewed Maney after three days of keeping him. "Why are you keeping me?" Maney asked. "Because of the way you arrived," said the lead psychologist. "Do you have anything on me?" Maney said. "No," he responded. And in this way, they let Maney go. And Maney believed that it was in this very same way that hell had to give up Jesus after 3 days. In the first rehab, following his trip to the hospital, Maney would go back and forth to the bathroom, afraid he might kill himself at any second. He strived to prove to everyone that he wouldn't kill himself. And when he was in the bathroom, running the sink or flushing the toilet, he would hear screaming. They kept him there for at least 7 days, and the women who took in the patients began to wonder why they detained him so long. He had come in sober, and was quiet and kept to himself at all times. Having pity on him, at one time a woman in her 20s came into his small room and played checkers with him. They pulled out the game, opened the box, and put the board on a small round table between the bed and the door. They set the pieces on the table. Maney felt his hand stumble, and thought about the sadness that must be in his eyes. In that moment, he wished he had a higher spirit so he could bring them a moment of happiness. He was sorry, and wished he could look up and make her smile. During his time during this first rehab, he listened attentively, trying to hear sound in the white noise. Eventually in the middle of night he did hear sounds, and they came in short bursts, high-pitched. The sounds seemed to come from the ceiling of his bedroom, or as he thought of it, his prison cell. The sounds that Maney heard sounded like they were a record sped up 10 times faster than they should be. He concentrated on what he was hearing and decided he would try to play with the sounds in his mind by speeding them up and slowing them down, like a tape recorder. It seemed like, in general, Maney could remember the last 7 seconds of sound that he heard with his brain. These tiny bursts of sound were much faster than that. When Maney slowed the sounds down in his mind, he began to believe that there was a message in them and it was saying something along these lines to him personally. It went something along these lines: "Emmanuel, you always do this. Why do you speed up the expansion of awareness so fast? When worlds are on the cusp of disaster, beyond the balance point where there can be any kind of real stability, you rush in too fast, a leader of a pack of dogs, only to destabilize the entire balance of the world. You only bring on more danger, Emmanuel. In this case your actions upset the souls that have chosen to enter this special world that is on the brink of discovery. This world which is about to overthrow its dominators, its tormentors. These dreamers, like yourself who chose to be born here first to get to know one another once again, having forgotten what it means to be one. If you accelerate the awareness too quickly in a world like this, the dreamers may remember too quickly who they were before they came to this new world. These dreamers needed to forget everything so that they could start over, fresh. They wanted to feel the excitement of something new. They want to add a new layer to the tapestry of life. But if you remind them so quickly what it was they were trying to forget, their life in heaven, my friend, I'm afraid you aren't making any new friends. Pause. And, you may be upsetting your old friends more than a little. Most important, though, is that without the expansion of awareness of the new, uncharted aspects of awareness in a measured, practical way, the one returns to itself too quickly and finds itself looking itself squarely in the eye, knowing it has to go through the painstaking process of creating everything all over to give it another shot. It hurts the spirit, Emmanuel. You are too fast, Emmanuel, and too loud. You are a danger to yourself and others. That is why you are here, where you cannot hurt anyone. For the next 3 years you will spend time resting, and you will not have access to your higher perception. In this time, others can begin to catch up. You've started a chain reaction of awareness expansion that is beyond anyone's control. Pray that we can pick up the pieces. And if we are to beat the odds, as we often seem to do, we can try this all again in another life. Please try to control your excitement, and don't run so fast. You've left your dogs far, far behind you. All this was brought to Maney's attention as he laid in what was essentially a prison bed in this rehabilitation center. The voice in hyperspeed coming from the white noise reflected off of the ceiling in his cell still continued come from the future, back into the present to warn people like us here now, my friend, to not go the way of expanding awareness before learning how to open the heart. As we keep trying to teach you, over and over, there is great danger in jumping the gun like this, my friend. We know we are fast. We will do everything we can. The Creator may have overshot this time, but we will all do our best. Rest now. While he was listening late at night to the white noise and staring at the ceiling, at 2 a.m. he began to believe that if he kept catalyzing minds to explode with new awareness, it wasn't going to do any good. It was more likely to do more harm than anything. Those lightning flashes of brilliance, the sound and smell of fireworks of awareness, all of it was nothing if the heart was secondary to the mind. Maney was a dog that ran too fast. Why couldn't he stop? He was running too quickly from one awakening world to another, entering each with his pack of dogs to help bring the place on the brink of destruction to pure brilliance with light and love. As opposed to a black hole forgotten in space and time, an oblivion with no bard to tell its tale. But Maney did understand. He knew the risks. And Master so knew them too. Maney had succeeded. They had completed the initiations. This world would not fall. Maney still wondered though the 7 dogs and their potentially implied movements while they were expanding awareness with subtlety. Maney thought about the dogs, they moved thusly, perhaps, there was an implied authority structure. But they were such broken machines that they preferred to use motions and gestures to convey authority. Dog number 1 would nod, dog number 2 would clamp and rub his foot on the dirt the same if and when it was present. With great forbearance, he would do this in order to keep up the ruse of dog number 1 going. Dog number 3 pretended not to see at all. And she moved with the pack, with a good memory of what was going on. Dog number 4 was aware, and made sure to let you know that he was aware. So he trotted around, kind of like a Dalmatian, looking at number 3, who was pretending not to exist, and then he looked at number 2, that dog who was sad, and meanwhile dog number 1 pretended not to be number 1. And when he affirmed these things, he moved his head down for a moment in acknowledgement and felt that he, in fact, was running the show. But in fact number 5 was in the pack. And so observing, softly she moved about, and her movements were even more subtle. Half nod, a half shrug, a half tease, a half look, a half breath, and a half "oh my goodness, I'm still part of loving you," all showed through here because she was invisible, and had no defenses, therefore, visible. She moved along with the pack in this way, unseen. The 6th dog had nothing to say. All he did was write down everything that he observed. He was called the Scholar Dog, and he would have been given the title Dick Spot if that title hadn't already been around the dog number 2, who was called number 1 by number 1. But in truth the 6th dog was in action while nobody knew it. He was a pretender. Dog number 7 acted simply as a witness. He thought about how he could screw up the order of the pack, but didn't. Maney thought about the dogs, and how perhaps this would be the lingo of the masters of the future, making gestures that implied things that were implied, and made hand gestures which sounded like, to the best of his ability to express, a cascade of reeds bending through time. The second rehab after his stay in the first facility, they brought him directly to a better place where there were televisions and they could go outside twice a day for at least 20 minutes. In this second rehab, he played basketball with a black girl and pretended to be a teacher of some kind. But he couldn't shoot the ball and she didn't care. She followed him around and he hid from her. In the second rehab they would get trays of limited food and talk about how there are forbidden cigarettes. There was a TV. One afternoon while the TV was on and he was near the window, she came up to him and said, "What's wrong?" She could see his terrible depression. His beard was growing because there was no easy way to shave in that place. She said, "Are you Jesus or his brother James?" "I am the Lord." "Are you sure they were brothers?" Maney replied with a sly grin. And then he laughed. "I'm just teasing you." And she smiled, and in that moment they fell together. A few weeks later a woman came to save him. A Valkyrie. She had blonde hair. They walked outside together, and he felt liberation. He remembered to be thankful for the little things in life. The Valkyrie drove him home, in the sun, and then he began to plan how he would live his life, to save it. Part 2. The dream of the secret workers. Under the prison castle they crept and moved silently, posed as copies of their prison camp workers. And in the deep of the night, they operated. They were at the top of a tall pillar surrounded by a deep pit. Above them was a prison matrix, a building with many rooms. They worked together, silently on their oubliette island. Using computers, they typed away, secretly. Using their computers they would undo the greater prison of which they were a part. Typing away at dawn they would sneak out, but what they did at night was slowly, relentlessly, opening the minds of anyone and all that could hear them. Proxies, avatars, and they were so quiet. Working at opening up the minds of everyone that they connected with, typing methodically on top of a stone pillar surrounded by an endless pit. With a great prison system and castle over their head they continued. And they passed by the security guards to there and from there when the dusk and dawn guided them. They were a generation of beers, who brought the breath of life into a newly awoken media. And truly they were on the cusp of evolution as they changed the mood of the world whilst the trolls tried to darken it. They embraced the new mood that they were awakening. And they did this all the while the prison guards were unaware of their secret computer camp in the oubliette over a pit. And the secret workers spiritualized the internet silently, overtly, while the dark and secret controllers watched in vain. The crafty Loti voice of Mziani, the prestidigitator Annie. Mziani was wearing a thin, loose black dress with spaghetti straps. Only recently did she begin to demonstrate her interest in Maney. He now, after the 4 months of endlessly walking stoically when he was rejected by Janie, looking well in her eyes. The week before she realized he had shorn off his fullness of beard, she stomped outside when he left and yelled at him, "You look good. Whatever you are doing, keep it up." And he thanked her, turning his head as he walked on his way to home. She played songs on the jukebox, and when one came right on, a song about bringing someone to life by the brightness of their eyes, she turned to him and said, "Maney, do you like this song? I played it for you." And he said, "Yeah, I do like this song." He wasn't making the connections yet, but he would quite a bitely and just a bit lie. For an hour later, smoking cigarettes with a stranger in the full moonlight, a peculiar song came on which Annie played on the jukebox. Annie marched right out to the patio and looked at Maney, and he began to listen to the song, understanding now that the lyrics of the songs had significance, that she was trying to say something. As soon as the singer began to sing, she closed her eyes and began singing, yelling at the top of her lungs directly at Maney, who was 10 feet away. She sang the entire song with perfect memory of the words, complete with their grinding and straining delivery. She must have practiced. It was incredible. The lyrics went on and on about how she would do anything in the world for someone she wanted, commit crimes, go to prison, and even die. Manny began to shiver. Like a deer in headlights, he was beginning to understand. And he stood there in silence, his eyes unfixed on anything, his face expressionless. And he was not proud at this moment, but he also considered the fact that Annie was just barely then breaking up with her boyfriend, and was this all just a ploy to generate jealousy and save that relationship? After many long uncomfortable moments, Annie went back inside, silently. From that day forward, Annie made sure that Manny would have to try hard to get her back on his side, for she had put it all out there just then. After this night Manny became curious, and then interested, and then more interested, and through the weeks and months to come, he would play chess with Annie. Horrible chess. But he was ready to give this a try. This was exciting. Frightening, but exciting. Eventually a day would come when he was convinced she was truly single, but that would not be for some time to come. When that day would finally come, this endeavor, Manny thought, would be worth it. While he was pondering this one day many weeks later, he was walking through a shopping mall and he saw something amazing that he wanted, but he had no practical use for, so he walked away. But the next day he was excited, took courage, and made the purchase. He bought Annie an adornment that symbolized the world and power, sevenfold. In an awkward moment soon after at the bar, he called her over before she was about to go and he gave it to her. She thanked him 3 times and this was the closest they ever got to being together. He could feel her warmth all over his upper body for the next 2 days. But the chess really was horrible, and the bottom line was that whenever he tried, she pulled away from him. Relentlessly. And so, he never got to go to dinners and lunches with Annie. She was the only woman he actually savored the idea of spending time eating food with. In front of any other woman, Manny would be embarrassed. But not her, with her husky special voice, and a sideways turning waterfall laugh from an older world, a plane where the world was once at war and grandparents knew what it meant to be starving. Once when Manny was, unexpectedly even to himself, standing on top of a picnic table at night with a long black coat and 2 other strangers, Annie came out to smoke too and she climbed up and stood there too. She wanted to do that too. And Manny thought that in that moment, she was like a little sister, and he looked at her now with fawn eyes, in spite of their petty and awful chess game. "I'm about to make a mistake, in about an hour," she said, sitting next to Manny on his right one night weeks later, at that place Manny loved. It felt like a picnic bench just then. The colors inside the pub seemed dark and silver and yellow, all glowing. Manny was still working it all out. Was she still with someone? What is this demon right, this hand of fate? He thought. He turned his head and looked at her with a strange look, like he was trying to understand what he was seeing. In retrospect it must have been unnerving and maybe even humiliating to her, and he felt bad about it when he recapitulated everything that happened that night. Manny preferred, or liked to think he preferred, to get to know someone face to face, to talk to them at first, to learn about them before getting butterflies. But he was aware of the conundrum, that if you already were prepared ahead of time, those exciting butterflies, you just may never get them at all. But you may. The 10th minutes or so went by, and music played, and all the while Manny pondered uncomfortably. "I want to make a mistake," she said looking down, in the low voice directed at him. She was wearing a green dress. And Manny looked down and to the left. Okay, he thought, perhaps we should get to know one another, but it didn't work out that way. Just about then she was off, talking to someone else, and gone. All her efforts with respect to Manny, naught in a moment. Why was it a mistake for her to get close? And is it any wonder why I'm quiet? Manny thought, silently, with words, to himself. Once again his mind killed what could have been. He lamented, and yet he couldn't shake the idea that he truly had been real and true to himself. Nevertheless, the more he thought about that moment in the days and years to come, the more his heart would sink. One day a few years later, they became friends again and acknowledged one another. Maney relinquished his pride and met her foot to foot, thinking of the time that they stood on the picnic table together. And he bowed with his hands held together and said to her, with relief in his heart, "Namaste." The heart-wrenching game of chess was finally over. It was a stalemate. I saw her when she was a child. A unicorn was there. A village of squirrels. I saw her when she went to college. I wrote about it. Yule in the pub years after the rehab experience. It was a winter Yule and Maney was doing the rounds with Ascended Master Saint Germain and danced with him. He spun around and around with him. After three hours he went from Golgotha to the pub. And there, he saw most of the coven. And he loved them. And he went to the back patio, knowing that he was full of power, and smoked, and Jovestina showed up and she said, "God. I was feeling fine until I got here. 5 minutes before I got here my head started to hurt, a migraine." Maney believed it was because of him, for that night he was vibrating at an unusually high frequency. He was powerful at that moment, and the person that she was with looked weak and jealous to Maney at that particular time. And Maney was glad to be where he was, and he glowed. He looked at Jovestina and understood that much of what was going on was only going on for the first time for her. Later that evening, Maney walked into the bar. He could feel the space around him. Tiny stars moved and swooped about. He stood silent before the putt-putt machine, which was there before the air hockey machine, and he saw the mother of Kalanuki looking at him for the first time, though she'd seen him for many years. And she saw an angel dollar at $1. And she paused, and after 5 seconds went dead silent, paled. She had suddenly, finally, and now had seen the presence that was moving about. An angel grey dark wonder. Maney had noticed this many times before, but this time? He could see very clearly in the mirror behind all the liquor bottles that his eyes were sparkling. There was a tiny dot in the middle of his pupils that seemed to twinkle like Venus the morning star. It reminded him of something else that happened around that time. He saw Piri ask Katrina to look at his eyes. When Katrina was starting her shift and walked behind the bar to take over for Piri, who was about to leave. Maney could hear them, or at the very least, believed he could hear them. And immediately after Piri said this, they both looked at him, and for about a second or two, he could see both of their eyes, but they looked like large glowing orbs 3 inches in diameter as they gazed. That Yule night in the pub was really the ultimate turning point, because it was the night when the women all agreed that Maney was someone to desire. He saw them all, at least 5 of them, talking about him and looking at him from across the room where he sat with a stranger at a small table. The bar was so full, and when Maney would look at any of them, they would turn their heads away, fast. Later that night a beautiful woman named Hura, eventually to be named the Chipmunk, tried to dance in front of him with her strange unknown friend, and all he did was look at the floor. After about a minute he began to hold back his laughter, for indeed she reminded him of a chipmunk as she danced with her girlfriend. After that, about 15 minutes later, when Maney had scored a seat at the actual bar, she came over bursting with energy, and she rubbed her right breast against his left shoulder, much lie. While she was doing this she had a profane-sounding conversation involving her interest in a potential pool boy. Maney was excited, but he wasn't interested in being a pool boy, so, in his mind he bore 2 fiery bright blue swords in his hands to counteract the seductive act of the lovely woman with great shorts, who was going to the back patio to drink and smoke, a truth which he loved. Because he needed a real starting point to possibly be able to communicate with her. He whirled them both around like a Jedi for what felt like about 3 minutes, until she retreated. Maney wanted to start a relationship from the mental, then to the emotional, and then perhaps proceeded to the physical and or material. But in this world it was quite the opposite. Here it seemed that the natural progression was physical seduction, then control through emotional manipulation. Perhaps ultimately there would be a mental agreement, a real consummation. It was a strange world, and Maney was not of it, but in it. Maney and Hara both wanted to meet each other on the emotional plane. But they were approaching it from opposite sides, and it never happened. Mustavarisi, Hara, the rubbing of breast on his left shoulder, the blue lightsaber dance of deflection, the Yule night at his favorite bar when the women all stood struck by lightning, the dancing of the chipmunk, the sparkling of the eyes. But she looked so fine with blue shorts walking out on the patio to smoke and drink cocktails. She wore enormous black sunglasses in the summer. With much adore. Resisting the cute, adored. Maney made his march home. And it hurt everyone. It hurt that he was real. It hurt. And he loved the chipmunk tenderly, evanescently, and with absolutely, but never did she know. His heart was wide open, and it wept, unseen. Again. Lisha Northerly dream of fuck me Maney, she said, out of the blue. They were sitting at one of the booths. Baffled, Maney looked to the other one at the table. That's what I heard, said one of his closest friends, and a lie. He validated that Maney had not been audio hallucinating things. A teacher, a married teacher, a student of very strict teachings, she was. A beautiful, well-educated person. Maney looked over at Lisha. She, married, said it must be the beer and walked away. After evil was defeated on the astral plane at the end of that same year, Maney woke up on New Year's Day and saw 4 squirrels playing, undefeated and happily together, playing a new game. In his mind he got Lisha up on his shoulders and walked around the suburb he lived in, behind the plaza where heaven was. Lisha riding his shoulders while he smoked his cigarette, he saw love, and how new rules had been written which wouldn't be understood for years to come. And they both had the breath of smokers. And Maney loved it, and he waited for something, thinking about her breath, without clinging. He waited for the cigarette smoking witch to be born that would join him on another plane. And finally, looking alone into a mirror, he saw in his bathroom the red ember of his cigarette. He took a breath after kissing her, first on the forehead, and then on the lips, and ran his hand through her golden hair. It was like milk and honey. Condesa. When he looked at her in the pub, Maney could see her subtle presence. She, too, had played a song for him, and he could see her fawn brown eyes now. Her aura is pure white. And she is the only one that looks that way. I'm reminded of a fountain, and she is a healer. She is gentle, and when she looks, though not necessarily so often, she sees. Emmanuel, I want to dance with you, she said to Maney. I can't, he responded, and looked at her boyfriend of over 10 years, Mussy. Mussy, can Maney dance with me? She yelled to him. They were standing in front of the jukebox, but her boyfriend was at the far end of the bar. I don't give a fuck, he said as if he really didn't care, though not in an upset tone. Then she looked at Maney and he said just because he said it, doesn't mean he means it. And she looked disappointed and Maney felt his heart sink, because all he wanted to do then was hug her tightly and kiss her. The next time he saw her, out front, he explained his motivations. They were talking outside in the evening, finishing up cigarettes. There were 2 reasons I didn't dance with you. First, dancing is intimate. She said, did you hear me? I said Maney smiled but tried to redirect the conversation. I had a teacher, and he was incredibly wise. He was a ballet dancer, and yet when he was older he said, just don't ask me to dance, I will never dance anymore, except with a sword. I understand now why my teacher Master Tso said he will never dance anymore. He walked with demolition feet, Master Tso. This is just my personal theory, but I think it is true. It was because he didn't want to harm anyone anymore. While there was anyone left suffering in the worlds, who could dance? And Maney thought to himself, what student is greater than his teacher? I love you, Maney, she said. I love you too, he replied. And it was true. And again his heart sank, for how many feelings would he ever have to cancel for the opposite sex? More than could be counted. the mother of Candice's funeral, and the email to Kitty, who wrote ultimate at the funeral procession, "My mother has just died. Her funeral will be here," wrote Candice. Manny was utterly spent. But his heart told him that this, he would be present for. He thought this was in his own town, the town of the prophets, but it was not. And yet, after making the decision, he decided that there was no turning back. He was going. After a long drive, he arrived at the destination, but when he got to the inn, there was no vacancy. "No way," he said. "Where can I sleep?" But the innkeeper had no words for him. So he moved on. Navigating through the unfamiliar territory, he ended up in another lobby and asked for a room. "We have nothing other than a king's suite," said the innkeeper, and Manny said, "I'll take it." He was in debt, a fool with his credit. And so he ended up with a fine set of rooms, more than he needed, and began to prepare for the calling hours. He stood in the bathroom, shaking. He took a shower and put on a dress shirt and tie, and looked at his arms and hands. They were shaking. He could barely even grab anything, they shook so much. He finally decided to drink something to help it go away. And he reflected on his day. After 1.5 beers, he drove on his way to the decided upon place, still shaking too much. And when he arrived, he said, "Where is Candice?" They told him that she was in the upper room where the water bearer was, the herald of the new Aquarian age, up and to the east. And so he looked there, and he found her. Incredible she was. But first, on his way he found the priest. The priest immediately reminded Manny of Padre Pio, an Italian saint who routinely got stigmata when performing Mass. Manny was comforted by his presence. When he found the break in conversation, Manny went up to him directly, and said, "I am thirsty." And the priest said, "Are you thirsty?" And Manny responded, "I haven't drank enough, and my mouth is dry. Where can I find the water fountain?" And so the priest, a Franciscan, said, "Follow me." And Manny followed the man, around a corner. The priest said, "I thought there was one here but..." And then he led Manny to a water fountain, and Manny drank. And in this manner, the priest gave Manny water when the least of them asked for something to drink. When he met Candice, she was surprised. Candice glowed in Manny's eyes. Candice offered him candy to eat, which she made herself with her mother's recipe and style. But Manny's hands shook too much, and he had to use his left hand to stop his right hand from making serious mistakes. With much embarrassment, his left hand grabbed his right wrist when he tried to pick up a piece of candy off of the circular table in the funeral room. Candice felt the candy would honor her mother's spirit, and she used a recipe that her mother had made when she was with her. Her mother's body was in a casket at the other end of the room, and Manny, after eating the candy, went up to it and looked sullenly at her in respect. He then talked to the priest again. "Candice and Mussy got married in their mother's house," said the priest, "when they learned that she was about to die. I administered the wedding. They changed their plans from what they had originally wanted to do for their wedding in the last moment." "That's awesome." "That's very special," said Manny. "It was," responded the priest. He then meandered, uncomfortable, in the hall and saw Mussy, standing in the doorway to the room where the casket was, and said, "I'm so nervous." And Candice came over, glowing, and he with his beard at the time showed her his smile, and she, like a spirit, shook his hand. And she had to go, to talk with women, but first Manny asked her when the hour would be, and she said 10 o'clock, tomorrow morning, and he confirmed the address with her. Before he left, Mussy reached out to him, for the first time, and shook his hand and looked at him directly. Respect was paid to all that evening. That night in the suite, Manny watched old TV shows, and saw strange synchronicities. He woke up the next morning and took a shower. He had breakfast in the inn in haste, and remembered his travels overseas. Then he drove to the church, after driving around, looking at a map and consulting with a woman in a gas station, while a man looked on at their encounter in wonder. He had to navigate around a lake, making both left and right turns. Finally, he arrived at the church, and had to park very far away. He was wearing a thick, long-sleeved white collared shirt, with minimized buttons. And he burst the door open in the last moment, with fresh morning light behind him, and saw Condesa, with tears in her eyes, looking at her mother's casket, surrounded by Franciscan priests, during a ceremony that wasn't meant for the whole church, but only for her direct family. And Condesa looked at him, and mouthed the words with teary eyes, Hermione. And Maney nodded in deep respect, and wasn't sure where to go, so he stopped outside of the doorway into the church worship room proper, and looked at Condesa and the priests giving her mother the final death rites. He watched this final ceremony, and then they closed the casket. The Franciscan priests didn't seem to mind that Maney viewed this most sacred of ceremonies, unexpected though he was. And before it all was over, Maney figured that it would be best if he then opened the door to the worship hall, enter, and prepare for the Mass. He did so, and witnessed one of the greatest services he'd ever been a part of. The priest who he'd met last night gave one of the greatest sermons he'd ever heard. And that day, Maney was the only one who wore white. And when he walked in at the last moment with his beard, he wondered what the priest thought of him. Maney listened attentively. He did not expect to, but after the service, seeing that Condesa was tied up talking with other older family members, he did not hug her but got in line outside for a funeral procession for Condesa's mother. A man put a flag on his car. It turned out he would be the second to last in the procession, exceeded only by an older woman who would guide him through the terrible journey to the grave site, which took over a half an hour. And while this happened, he almost got arrested as he made strange decisions while driving, and a van drove unusually fast by him, cutting through the funeral procession, and a cop turned on lights and pursued the van. Maney's heart was thumping. He was so afraid that he'd get pulled over. At the cemetery, he met the woman who was following him, after he accidentally pressed the remote trigger for his car horn at the quiet cemetery site after getting out of his car, embarrassed. But she didn't seem to notice, and she apologized for her driving. Maney said you did so great, and thanked her, and they became friends. And then he watched the Franciscan priests and monks sing a secret song, the priest who gave the ceremony in the church with tears in his eyes. The song was about the temporary nature of life and things. And after the song and the crowd was departing, Maney met and shook the hand of the priest, and met him. After the burial, there was a gathering where people would eat. Condesa was there, and Maney and the older woman he met got in line and ate the ethnic Slovak foods that were prepared, and Condesa warned him of the ethnic nature of the food. "I love it," he responded. And then he ate the food in front of the older woman with his hands shaking, in embarrassment. He steadied his right hand with his left, and ate baked beans and cabbage, and turned down offers of drinks with sugar. Finally, the priest came over and Maney told him how he lived his sermons so much, and asked him questions of an occult nature, because as he told the woman, surely, this was one of the greatest men I've ever met. Holding back tears, he said, I am lucky to have personally met men of knowledge in my life. But the priest did not have answers for Maney. When he left, he went to shake the hand of the woman he met, but she gave him a hug instead. And he also shook the hand of the Franciscan priest, who reminded him of Padre Pio, and he felt truly blessed. Before he left, the woman tried to guide him home by using a map, but after getting the basics from said map, Maney told her he was okay, that he'd make it home, and she said, "Are you sure?" And he looked at her with unusual sternness and said yes. And he left. During the gathering, the older lady had recommended he visit a particular cathedral called the Fallen Red Dance of Aritecha in Condesa area. And he thanked her for this information. As it turned out, this particular place was almost exactly on his route home, and so he did absolutely visit this place at the last minute, and he wrote her an email using an address they exchanged, to tell her his appreciation of her guardianship and friendship in the fellowship hall after the ceremonies that he would have otherwise found to be very hard to be in all alone. He also told her that she was right, that the cathedral she described which he would visit on his way home was wonderful and amazing, and he thanked her from the bottom of his heart in peace. Hello Kitty, first of all, I wanted to say that it was so good to meet you. A gift. I was thinking on my way home from Darnello, wow. What if Kitty hadn't been there? That gathering at the end, where we were eating, would have been a hard room for me to navigate. I'd be sweating bullets, not knowing what to do. Lol. I wouldn't have lasted long. There were a few things I wanted to share. Guess what? I did go to the Fallen Red dance of Aritecha in Casevar on my way home that day. It was exactly on my course home, and there just seemed to be too many indications that I should go there. So I did. Wow. I mean, wow. I went to the basement, like you said. And I was blown away by it. I sat the last row and had to take off my dress shoes. They seemed so loud in that quiet place it was not acceptable. So, I walked around in my socks, holding up pants so as to make as little sound as possible. I saw some of the relics you described, and lit a candle. Someone came in and out, but mostly there were about 4 other people in there, all seated in silence. I stayed there for about 20 minutes and said a prayer to myself. It was so beautiful, and so powerful. That experience alone could turn someone Catholic, at least if they got to live in Casevar. Lol. Amazing. And then I went upstairs. Whoa. When I was in Aritecha I got to visit a legendary cathedral, but this could not be beat. I even got to hear them doing some kind of evening mass. I'm not sure exactly to offer whom. There was barely anyone there, but you could creep inside and see it happen, and it sounded so beautiful and amazing. I went around the stairs to the top and looked in. Same thing. I felt I shouldn't even be there, and I left. I couldn't believe my fortune. It was so cool, thank you for telling me about it. I also have some other great news. I qualified for unemployment. Phew. That is a huge weight off my shoulders. I'm so lucky to get this. It completely changes the game. Also, I told my parents that I lost my job, and I feel pretty good about it. It was a good email to them. So, I hope you get this and it reaches you in good spirits. I'm so glad that Father Dan asked you to the funeral. So one thing, and this should be obvious, and I kinda got it while we were there, but Maria is actually Father Dan's sister. He was performing the funeral for his sister. I did not fully soak in that nuance while I was there. Is that so? Again, I think you told me, but that is stunning. Thanks, hope you are having a great one. D. Maney. At one of his help desk jobs, Maney had heard some men who liked to say right and all right at the end of their sentences a lot, and he found it kind of null funny, so he started to say it to himself a lot and laugh about it. He had begun to talk to himself all the time in his loneliness. He hadn't been in a relationship for a very long time, and he needed to keep himself company. After a while, he began to say right and all right and variations of it a lot in a quiet voice, just for fun. And he imagined eventually that it was a little mouse talking to him. This provided endless amusement for Maney as he walked home in the moonlight to his car at the help desk in those days, or pacing around his apartment of mirrors and couture art in the evenings when he didn't know what to do. Julianica was an artist with curly blonde hair, an unusual trait, Maney thought. It seemed like she was always drunk, but in such a beautiful way. She was smiling. But she wasn't though. She was a beer drinker, for God's sakes. He loved her shorts. He liked that it seemed thematic that she, too, wore those shorts that had designs on the back pockets. Hers were a bit longer and thinner than hers. Piri and Julie embodied an evanescence that tickled heart and throat. Maney saw and felt all of this, and it made him think of shorts and drinks and cigarettes and being alive on Fridays and all the freshness of life and breath that may go along with it.